this being a Morning Glories event. Of course, most of our programs are every second Tuesday of each month, 7 o'clock in the afternoon. These programs are put on brought to you by Master Gardeners, Extension volunteers here in Coweta County. I'm Alan Summerlin, and Deborah Williams is emceeing with me this evening. For any first-time attendees, okay, we got something for you. Somebody's coming in behind you, giving you a folder. Can y'all hear me? Yeah. Okay. I am shouting. I don't think the mic's working, but it feels nice anyway, you know. Before we really get going, let me quickly mention this being our last program of the year. I'd like to express our thanks, and I know you would like to express your thanks for the full year of our hospitality committee being so dedicated in bringing us nice snacks to have at our BYA meeting. So let's okay, all right. Well, let's get going. Good shout.
Okay, we have drawings. We have more than usual. We got 10 days.
But you had to call in to be eligible now. So if you didn't call in, your name's not in this.
I'm sorry, call in next time.
All right, let me introduce the plants or the items that are available. Should your name be drawn, we do this at the end of the program, of course. We've got 2 bags of soil cubic. This is the 1 cubic foot bag. This is the basic soil cube mix. And this is a new product that's coming out with. It's specially formulated for a vegetable garden. It's a veggie mix. And we'll be talking about this. The composition of this right here, if you go to their website, has a real good explanation of the contents of the soil cube. Okay, we have these poppy seeds from Baker Creek, which is a premier heirloom plant distributor. So this arrangement would be one price, and then there's a second. They're all poppies, and they're all good for planting right now. Okay, from Southern Roots. Oh my gosh, I'm getting reading glasses. Okay, Golden Helva. This is from Southern Roots. They're on 29 Highway. And from Lowe's, we have this rosemary Christmas tree. Oh, really nice. Okay, from Petals from the past, we have this rose bush. This is an antique rose bush. You can have this one or any one out on the table if you should win this, okay? But this is a pretty good selection I got here for you. Thornless. Okay, from Breaking Ground Nursery, we have Autumn Amethyst Encore Azalea. And now I know the name of my shirt. This is Amethyst. But anyway, beautiful plant from Country Gardens Family Farm. This is like a Zeddy McCole hot brick thing that is monogrammed by them. It's their product. And from across the street over the Mortgage Market, the greenhouse, the county greenhouse, we have a $25 gift certificate from Morgan Market. So, and as you know, he's kind of getting into the retail there, and it's a good place to go visit and see what they have. Okay, again, I'd encourage you to support and thank the people who donate these prizes as you shop at their location.
Okay, and I just wanted to say a bit about BYA Extension. I know you can call them and get a lot of information from them, or go on their website and you can download applications that can help you start, and not only that, they'll do different things. The UG extension translates science for everyday living for farmers, families, and communities to foster a healthy and prosperous Georgia. So then you can go on that website and you can find so many things, not just gardening, that can help you in your everyday life.
Before I address that, let me mention, Kathy Hefner, one of our master gardeners, brought these plants in. If you don't have any of these plants and you walk by them, pick you up one of each. We have dwarf wandering Jew and basket plants, common name, Calesia fragrans, I think. Okay, what do we have up there? Hydrangeas. Clearly the picture was made in the spring, because that's when they bloom. Well, I took that picture yesterday. I want to accentuate a term that we've been using for the last year and a half, and that's the remontant hybrids of the macrophyllus. Okay, this is a remontant macrophylla. Okay, quick story on this plant. It's the first year it has bloomed in the fall. I want to tell you a quick story. I was in Italy about 7 years ago in a cathedral. People was lighting the candles, and I was up there lighting the candle. A guy bumped into me. And I looked. I said, "Hey, Coach, what are you doing here?" It was Vince Dooley. So this is my wife and I and Vince at the chapel there. The photo was made by Barbara, who was really more famous than Vince. You know? And of course, bless his heart, he lived to be 90 and he died a couple of weeks ago. But his plant lives on. And that's something special about plants. They are such great gifts because they represent the giver. He was shocked that somebody knew him in Italy. He thought he was in a hideout, you know, really let it all hang out, but here we were watching him. But I told him, I said, now I've sent you 2 letters and 1 email trying to get you to come to do our BYA program. And you have not, you know, come through yet. He said, well, I will. He said, I'll tell you what. He gave me his business card. At that time, he was the athletic director. He said, I'm coming out with a new line of macrophyllas called a Dooley. And I'm going to give you one, Alan, just because I have kind of shortchanged you on getting to your program. So 3 weeks later, I went through Athens and picked up my Dooley, back up one, and that's Vince Dooley's Dooley. So, check out the remontants. There's a trick to pruning them to make them bloom. And of course, a regular macrophylla blooms on old growth, previous year's growth. All right, the remontant one blooms on both growth, last year's and this year's. All right.
Okay, we have dates that we want you to remember. There's some flyers back on the table if you didn't get one. We're having a spring plant sale, April 15th. So it's on Saturday. And we're also having a spring garden tour. That's on May 20th. So make sure that you write those down.
Okay, Soil Q. We have the donations here for our door prizes. We work in conjunction with them, or we have a relationship where when you purchase online, whether it be the big bag, which is a cubic yard, or if you buy the small bag, if you use the Coweta Master Gardeners, Coweta Mini 22 entry code, if you purchase it using that code, then our organization receives $5 per bag or $15 per bag on the large And of course, these, our financial issues here, our biggest expense is that we provide 5 to 6, maybe 7 college scholarships each year, always associated with horticultural curriculum.
When you order it, you pick it up at the super side store, which is on Home 60.
That's the small bags you gotta pick up there. The large bags, they will deliver it and put it in your living room. Okay. Our program is born and brought to us by Jason Powell from Jameson, Alabama. Jason and his wife Shelley opened Petals for the Past in 1994. The Petals for the Past, the Powells apply a contemporary technique in growing finest old garden plants along with the newest varieties. Many factors helped prepare Jason for his outstanding nursery career. Jason obtained a Bachelor of Science from Auburn University and a master's degree from Texas A&M. His wife Shelley as well has a horticultural degree from Texas A&M. Jason's passion for the science he represents is obvious when you look at the operation model of his nursery, a model based on educating the customer. As well, Jason's passion shows in his traveling almost every week to different locations, helping gardeners make good choices and using good gardening techniques. Please give a warm welcome to our friend from Alabama, Jason Powell.
This is my favorite place to come. You guys, I've not ever received such a warm welcome as I get every time I come to Newton, and I appreciate the Alameda County Backyard Association and the programs that you've put on. I look forward to it every year. We've done morning programs, we've done evening programs, and they've all been so enjoyable. And I appreciate so much that invitation to come over. As Alan mentioned, I got my undergraduate degree from Auburn University. I studied landscape design, horticulture. I finished up with my master's degree from Texas A&M. So I'm here today, thankfully, to talk about gardening and not football. Two programs that are miserable this year, and that we all apparently are paying. From Auburn, where my undergrad is, I think we're still paying 4 previous coaches. Football coaches. Another one put on the roster role. So we're only going to talk gardening today. All right. At any rate, as Alan mentioned, the other part I wanted to talk about is I grew up in a family that was very much involved with the extension service. My dad worked as a food specialist for the state of Alabama. But before that, we were in Tipton, Georgia, where he worked for the University of Georgia. Before that, I was born in College Station, Texas, because my dad's first job was with Texas A&M University as a fruit specialist as well. And so, growing up as a little guy, my dad had one garden philosophy. My dad believes if you can't eat it, don't grow it. And some of you may. I noticed this veggie mix over here with Soil Cube. I know we've seen over the last 3 years, especially, so much interest in the edible aspect of gardening that if you weren't already vegetable and herb gardening, you probably are now as well. And so, for a little guy growing up, that meant a lot of things for me. If your dad is a food specialist, that meant every summer I could jump in the car and travel with him all over the state of Alabama to visit in the southern portion of our state all the blueberry growers in June. In the middle portion of the state, where I am now, I'm in a little town called Jameson, Alabama, and that's in Chilton County, and we're known for peaches right there. And then in the fall, before we would go back to school, or late summer, before I had to go back to school, we would be in the northern portion of the state. That's where most of our apple and pear production is located. And so, as a little guy growing up, I got to see very, very early on how important a land grant is, land grant university is to a state, and how meetings like this, how effective they can be, because we get the interaction, we get to talk about what are you having success with, what techniques are you using, we get to talk about some of the latest finds of pruning techniques for science are, and that to me is one of the unique things about gardening, whether it's ornamental or whether it's edible, that makes it so important to be a part of. And then, of course, with the addition of the Master Gardener program, we've seen that be able to spread and expand to the far reaches. And pick a title, pick a subject, and thankfully there's interest, and there's going to be an opportunity to learn more about it. So when I finished school, I decided I wanted to study horticulture. But again, growing up, my dad believed anything like an acre or vegetable garden was a waste of time because he had a son who could go up and down those roads. Right? So when I finished high school, I knew I loved plants, and I wanted to have a career that could involve education and horticulture. But I was done with vegetables. I wanted to get into ornamentals. And so I decided to study landscape design and horticulture, and I did 3 internships throughout my experience at Auburn, and loved it. And when I finished at Auburn, I've told this story each time that I've come here, but when I finished at Auburn, there were 100 undergraduate students. There was 50 boys, 50 girls. There were 5 jobs, literally, for every graduate that was coming out of there. My problem was I couldn't figure out which one of those jobs, which one of those 5 that I wanted to have. And professors at Auburn, I'm sure it's the same at the University of Georgia, are very understanding when you have that predicament. They put their arm around you and they reassure you, you don't have to know exactly what you want to be. In fact, if you're not sure, just keep taking classes until you figure it out. It's the simplest solution. Way back when I was in school, we were still on the quarter system. We hadn't moved to the semester system. So they just said, write a check for another quarter. What do you want to be able to grow up? And so my parents had a different philosophy. They said that they knew many college graduates who, upon graduation, just went out and got a job and figured out, from there where to go. And then many of those same graduates moved out of the house. Doesn't sound like a good plan at all. So I decided, though, after much thought, I decided maybe I should do a combination of those two. So I applied to graduate school, and I was accepted at Texas A&M University. And one of the first things that you do when you go out and you're looking to go to another school, particularly for a master's degree, you're looking to interview all professors and figure out who you can develop a rapport with, so that you can talk, them conduct their research, and you can complete your classes and graduate and get your degree. And so I met all the professors there, and one of them that stood out to me, and I just was so excited to have the opportunity to work with, was Dr. Bill Welch. And if you look at the titles of the books that Dr. Welch has authored, it gives you perfect insight into what his interests are. Antique roses from the South. That's one of the first things we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about roses that were introduced prior to 1867 that can still exist and are occurring in and around all over Georgia. We're going to talk, he wrote a book called The Southern Heirloom Garden. So here's a guy who's more interested in the plants our grandmothers grew than the newest introductions of azalea or hydrangea or rose. And that to me was very intriguing. And so I sat down with him and I said, Dr. Welch, I want to come to school here. I'd like to work with you, but can you tell me why? Every other professor I've interviewed is interested in the newest introduction of plant. Why are you gardening with and writing about my grandmother's plants when it seems like all the excitement's over here? Every garden magazine that I picked up at that time was featuring the newest, the latest. That was where the excitement was. He said, sure. Jason said, you're going to be here for the next 2 years? He said, I can tell you exactly why I do this in one sentence. Or he said, if you think you're up for a challenge, you can garden with me over the next 2 years, and you can figure it out for yourself. Well, that was all I needed to hear, because that was an apprenticeship. And every gardener in this room knows you really learn about gardening by jumping in, right? You've got to learn about your soil, and you can only do that on your hands and knees in the garden. You've got to learn about what grows well for you, what weeds do you have. I currently have all of the weeds on the poster of Salvation Weeds. So, kind of a claim to fame. But at any rate, so he said, I can answer in one sentence, or you can garden with me over the next 2 years. And he and his wife had moved to early 1900s Victorian home to where it now sits at the foothills of the hill country of Texas, a little town called Round Top. And Round Top has even poorer soil than where I live now, and that's just that rough clay loam. It's extremely difficult to garden in, and the closest thing we have in Alabama to relate to it is the the Black Belt region of Alabama, which runs from Montgomery over towards Selma, and it's just been exhausted. So it's just gray clay, and gray clay doesn't really drain at all. So everything you do has got to be built up. So for the next 2 years, I gardened with Dr. Welch, and I figured out in the latter part of my studies there what I wanted to be when I grew up. I remember being on my hands and knees in that garden, and light bulb went on. And I decided I knew what I wanted to be, and it was good because Dr. Welch called me into his office. I think I was a month away from graduation. He said, "Jason, your mom's calling. She'd like to know what you want to be when you grow up." Going back home to Alabama, I'm going to apply the principles that I learned through my dad with the extension service, just like it's involved with the Master Gardener program here. I'm going to use the educational approach to gardening. I'm going to grow tough plants for southern gardens. That's our title today. I'm going to devote space to antique roses. I'm going to grow heirloom shrubs. I'm going to grow hardy perennials, herbs, and the whole 9 yards. And that's what I had learned from Dr. Welch. He was incorporating in this landscape that I was working with all of those things. A cottage style of garden is the style of garden I was working with. And of course, our goal with a cottage garden is to have 12 months of interest. Thankfully, we live in the South, and we can have 12 months of interest. It can combine bulbs, it can combine reseeding annuals, it can combine shrubs, it can combine roses, it can combine the whole 9 yards. And to me, that is the very exciting part. So that has been our goal from when we began the nursery in 1994. And I still contend that starting any business, whether it's a nursery or anything else, the best time to do it is right out of school when you're so young and dumb. You don't know. I didn't know what to be afraid of. I just went headlong. I wasn't just young and dumb. I was stubborn. And that's another good thing to put in there. You're not going to accept failure. You just go in there and get it done. So our approach to the nursery industry is one of an educational approach. And the two main efforts that we try to achieve that goal is we try to plant everything that we're growing in a garden setting. I would like for you to be able to see what these plants look like in the landscape when they're 14, 15, 18 years old, versus having to decide just based on what it looks like in that 1 gallon container. That 1 gallon pot that Alan held up with that rose, that was rendered from a stem cutting 2 years ago. So you can't really make very many good decisions about it. But that variety is called Daisy's blueberry. And if we were to look at that in the landscape today, you would see the original plant that was planted 17 years ago, that's now 6 feet tall and 6 feet wide, completely covered with fragrant single-petal pink blooms. And in addition, it makes a hip. And the hip, remember, is the rose fruit. And the rose hips on Daisy's blueberry, which is that thornless rose, get to be the size of a nickel. And they turn orange-red the fall winter. And it's completely thornless. But when you see that in the landscape, it lets you learn so much about it. I can maybe only be 1 instead of 3 in that corner. I can see that it's on no irrigation. And so that's a little bit of what we're trying to do. So display gardens help us to learn and to share that information. And then the second effort that we make is we host workshops and classes just like this. We like to have each month at least 2 different classes or workshops. And so that's kind of our whole approach. I'm very, very thankful that I have my whole family involved. My dad retired from Auburn University in 2000, and I hired him immediately. And I will tell you this, I've told Melanie and Amy this, he's working harder for less than he ever is, right? But I'm getting back some of that acre vegetable garden. And he's helped us to diversify. He has now 7 acres displayed fruit gardens. And at 84, my dad doesn't miss a day of work. On my drive here, he texted me my to-do list when I get back. And so, in addition to my dad, my mom is full-time with us. She does all of our propagation. We grow about 80% of all of our plant material right here at the nursery, using the display gardens as our mother plants. And then I was very fortunate, while I was a graduate student at Texas A&M, to meet a young lady named Shelley, who is the most knowledgeable plants person I have ever met. And I convinced her to marry me and leave her home state of Texas. She left Texas, and no native Texan really leaves Texas, right? Now the world is built around Texas. So she's still looking for the oil. I promise it's on the property. For sure. But Shelley's, one of her many responsibilities is to go find great plants like this swamp rose, which is native to Georgia, Alabama, and Florida. And so she travels all over the state. She's looking for great plants. She goes to home sites. She goes to cemeteries. She goes to botanical gardens. And she goes to gardeners' homes who have called and said, hey, you can have this plant. And my wife is uniquely suited to this. She's the only person I know who can identify a plant at 50 miles per hour. We got the right person in the car. But let's talk about roses for a moment. We'll kick this program off, and I promised Alan, he said, remember, you only have 3 hours for this. I'm gonna zip right through it. He'll give me the signal. 3 hours, sure. But my first introduction to roses was hybrid teas. My first job was with a nursery in Auburn where I was growing up when I was in the 9th grade, and it was hybrid teas. They always give hybrid tea potting to the new guy or the new girl, right? If you can survive transplanting all those hybrid teas, then they're going to keep you on staff for sure. But I was introduced to hybrid teas. Those are the most, they have the least amount of resistance to anything. We go through spring typically with hybrid teas. They put on a beautiful show, and then they get black spot and powdery mildew or rust or all of it. They drop every leaf and then spend the rest of the summer bare. And then if they make it to fall, it's a surprise. So when Dr. Welch started talking about roses, I was very, very much in the dark. And he said, we need to talk. You need to learn about this class of roses. The roses that were introduced prior to 1867, the ones that are truly considered antique or old roses. And so, by definition, an antique rose is any variety of rose that belongs to a class of roses that were introduced prior to 1867. Why 1867? That's the year the first modern hybrid tea rose was introduced. So when we look at pre-1867 roses, the roses our great-grandmothers and grandmothers would have grown, we're going to find 3 characteristics that I think make them worthwhile for you to consider. Number 1, fragrance. When we go back to our grandmother's roses, we find roses that smell like roses. Doesn't that seem like a silly thing to say? But modern rose breeding from 1867, when the first hybrid tea rose was introduced, all the way through the 1930s was really governed more by the florist industry. And the florist industry wanted long stems, big flowers, bright colors. And I would say they have achieved those goals brilliantly. But just like in animal breeding, when plant breeding, if you're looking at only 1 or 2 characteristics and you're selecting for those, you often lose beneficial characteristics during the process. And one of the great characteristics or traits that was lost was fragrance. Second characteristic that I like about old garden roses that we can incorporate into our landscape is overall shape. When you look at this rose right here, this is a variety called the swamp rose. And this is the bottom. This is where the canes are. This is ground level. The swamp rose is a southeastern native rose, and they call it swamp rose because it's found along creeks where the water will rise during the winter, and that soil stays wet all winter. And then in the summertime, when the creeks are down, it's in dry soil. So this rose is full at 6 feet height and 6 feet of width. You can't see the canes like you can in a modern hybrid tea. So when we go back to our old garden roses, we not only get great fragrance, we're going to find great shape. And the third characteristic, probably the most important, and that's disease resistance. You and I can grow roses in our garden with careful selection, but we do not have to spray. And that, to me, makes them especially worthwhile. So I want fragrance, I want great shape, and I want a plant that when you look at it, it has an overall appearance that's attractive. It's not just pretty for about 3 or 4 weeks and then it's done. So you can, if you have 4 to 6 hours of sunlight, incorporate these old garden classics into your garden as long as you've got good drainage. And so we'll talk about them. They belong to different classes. The rose that probably would set the whole rose world on fire is the China class of roses. So if we have the broad-heading antique roses, beneath it would be divided into different classes. Chinas, old garden teas, and so on and so on. And within those varieties, within those classes, China, species, old garden tea, you're going to find varieties with names. So Old Blush is, for example, the variety of China rose. How many of you have grown Lady Banks rose? Or Lady Banks? What color is Lady Banks? Yellow. Did you ever think of Lady Banks as an antique rose? It's an 1824 introduction. That's pre-1867. But there's a white flower in the form of Lady Banks that was introduced 20 years earlier, and it actually has fragrance. And so I always love to talk about that. So when you think about the species class of roses, within that there are varieties, and Lady Banks is a variety of species class of roses. Interestingly, we've all grown it. We all love it, but has anybody ever successfully imposed their will on ladies? Made her do just what you want her to do? No way. Nobody's ever answered yes to that. But it's a worthwhile rose to have in your garden. But where could you use it? I've seen some of the prettiest lady banks just out in the corners of a fence that's a pasture separating an area that was maintained by bush hog from an area that was maintained in display gardens, and it was just allowed to ramble and roam. And I think that's the prettiest way to use a rose like that. But the China class of roses, these are, there were single petal versions of this class of rose in existence 1,000 years before the birth of Christ. So these are no newcomers to gardens. But the characteristics that we associate with them are pretty unique. Whereas the species roses, like Lady Banks, are once blooming, the China rose, or class of roses, were the first roses to be introduced or found to be repeat blooming. Alan mentioned the term remontant. This is the first class of roses that was discovered to be remontant. It was introduced in 1752. French and English explorers were beginning to travel at that time, and at the time, early 1700s, they had lots of great roses, albas and damasks and centifolias, some of these wonderful old, large, cabbage-shaped roses, but they only bloomed for about 3 or 4 weeks during the spring. So these French and English explorers, that's all they knew. Well, when they traveled to China, they discovered there were roses that were constantly blooming spring, summer, and fall. I can only imagine that they were very, very excited. And then I think they got off those boats, pillaged those roses, and took them back home to France and England, and began to cross them, or allow them to cross with their centifolias and albas and damasks. And here comes a whole world of production of what I consider the queen of the garden. So some of the roses they would originally brought back would have included Old Blush. And when you get into China roses, by the way, you're going to find a fruity type of fragrance. And in Newnan, Georgia, the China roses like Old Blush, or Framboise superior, or Petals are always going to be the first roses to bloom in your garden. They're going to also be the last roses to finish. They will be in bloom at Christmas here in Newnan, Georgia, which seems crazy. But you can be 84 degrees like we will be today. And then you can be 30 degrees like we may be Monday morning. And the roses handle it. This is to me one of the great things when we look back, and I asked Dr. Welch the original question, why was he gardening with and writing about plants our grandmothers grew? I figured it out as a graduate student. These plants have survived, and they're still around today because they can tolerate the fluctuations that we have in temperature, in rainfall, and all of the above. And they can still come back and perform. So when we look at the China class of roses, we're going to find roses that are early to bloom and late to finish. We're going to find a fruity type of fragrance. You're going to find a great mixture of shrubs. You're going to find a great mixture of climbers as well. The Framboise superior, that's an 1832 introduction. It's a nice shrub, about 4 feet tall by about 4 feet wide. Petals is single petal. See how you have just a one layer of petal? And it exhibits something else that's unique to the China class of roses in that they open light. This is day 1 when the Petals is opening. This is day 2 or 3. And then day 4 or 5, it turns crimson. So you have all of those colors on that rose. But most of us are used to flowers opening dark and fading with sunlight. With the China roses, it's the opposite. Petals can be used as a tall shrub rose, 5 to 6 feet tall by 5 to 6 feet wide. Or you can trim out some of those canes and train it as a small climber over an arbor. So they're very flexible. Now, look at that. Now, does that look more like a rose, right? So the China class of roses was the original remontant blooming class. When we started getting into the 1830s, there were some natural crosses. One of them occurred between Old Blush, the second rose that we looked at, and Rosa gigantea, and as Chinese native. The product produced layer after layer after layer of petal, big flowers. And so what we see here became the old garden tea, which is the grandmother of the modern hybrid tea. So when we go back to the grandmother, this is the Arcant, for example, the first original old garden tea class were big flowers, large bud, but they have a cool, dried tea leaf fragrance. That's where the name comes from. The shrubs, like this is the Arcant in this group, are going to be 4 to 5 feet tall. They're going to be that wide. And they're also going to flower like their parent, the China rose. Heavy spring, heavy fall, and intermittently during the summer. This is the class that was planted all over the South. It's because the natural, the natural cross that occurred between Old Blush and Rosa gigantea occurred in an area of China where the climate is hot and humid. Does that sound familiar? So no wonder when these guys traveled and came in through Charleston, came in through Mobile, they naturally found a welcome home. And these are the kind of roses that we often find at cemeteries where they've been planted as memorials to loved ones. And in fact, we've been so fortunate to find a number of great China roses in cemeteries in Georgia, in cemeteries in Alabama, in cemeteries in Mississippi. Felder Rushing was the person that I think said it more correctly and put it in perspective for me better than anybody else. When we were collecting roses in a cemetery in Jackson, Mississippi, he said, Jason, look around you. He said, I want you to remember one thing. This is when I was a graduate student. And I said, what is that? He said, dead people can grow these roses. You can grow these roses. Yeah, and so, look at these layers of petals. But do you know what modern rose breeders didn't like about this? So here's this great big large double flowered rose, but it's a shorter stem and it's so heavy it looks at you. So it doesn't hold its nose up in the air, it leans over and looks at you. It gives you the perfect opportunity to stick your nose in there and smell it. So from a garden perspective, this is a great rose. This is not your long stemmed tea though. That comes later in the granddaughter. Duchesse de Brabant, another 4x4 foot old garden tea. This was Teddy Roosevelt's favorite. This is a good yellow in an old garden rose. We don't find bright colors in roses until we get into modern roses. So what you're noticing are lots of pastels, pinks, loads of pinks, few reds, and then light yellows. And then this is actually a found rose. There's some tea parentage in there, but one of the things that I love is that there are roses still waiting to be discovered. There are natural crosses that occur, just like that Rosa gigantea crossing with Old Blush. There are roses that are seedlings that haven't been introduced and that we've not even discovered. So there's still some mystery out there, some detective work to be done. Katy Road Pink was one of the study roses that we found outside of Houston, Texas, on the way to Houston, Texas. And this was not found by Shelley and I. This was found by another group that we got to participate with in conjunction with the Antique Rose Emporium in Brenham, Texas. We had a group that would meet once a month. We called ourselves Rustlers.
Doesn't that sound like a rough crowd to hang out with? So you would go rose hunting into all the places I was telling you about. Well, this one was found outside of Katy, Texas, on the way to Houston, Texas, along a roadside, an old home place. And it was given the study name Katy Road. The ability of these plants to be rooted from stem cuttings means that we can produce a genetically identical plant just by rooting a cutting and passing it along. And so Katy Road Pink was found and the Antique Rose Emporium introduced it. It produces a rose that's shoulder to head height, that wide. It has hips as big as Basie's blueberry that we were talking about a moment ago. It has nice fragrance and it has excellent disease resistance. But 8-10 years rolled by and it's discovered that Katy Road Pink actually had been introduced by Griffith Buck, who bred roses for Iowa State University, and its real name is Carefree Beauty. So if you've ever grown any of the Carefree series that Dr. Buck introduced, you've probably grown this one. It's, to me, one of the very, very best. So it's a rose that can survive, a summer in Houston, Texas, but can also survive a winter in Quebec, Canada. So he was breeding for Canadian winter survival, and we found it in Houston, Texas. So it makes it especially worthwhile. The Sweetheart Rose, Cecile Bruner, is in the Polyantha class. That's one of the nice ones. That's one of the ones that Verdun belongs to, Amy, that you've got. And they're not considered true antique roses by strict definition, but we like them because they have a lot of the same characteristics. Good fragrance, small individual blooms that occur in clusters, so they can go into your garden either in a container or as a low hedge. Pearl d'Or is about 3.5 to 4 feet tall and about that wide. Caldwell Pink, another one of those found roses outside of Caldwell, Texas. It makes a shrub that's about 4 feet tall but 5 to 6 feet wide. And it has never been discovered to be another variety that was already introduced. It still goes by its study name, Caldwell Pink. And then last but not least on roses, I want to introduce you to the Hurricane Katrina survivor. Many of you are familiar with this rose. This was where I first learned about it. This is the House and Gardens, one of that Dr. Welch allowed me to get involved with and to help care for. And I love that rose. It's a thornless climber. And when it was introduced, it wasn't called Peggy Martin. It was, Dr. Welch referred to it as the air conditioning rose because Peggy Martin had shared the cutting with him. It had been grown in her family around New Orleans, Louisiana for about 3 generations. And it had been grown in Baton Rouge. It had been grown in New Orleans. It had been grown in Medellin. It had been grown in some of the hottest, most humid places that you could possibly garden and thrived. And so after Hurricane Katrina occurred, Dr. Welch did convince Peggy to let him name that rose for her. And what we've learned about it since is that this is one vigorous rambler. It will run along the top of the ground until you lift it up and put it into place. And then it's Katie bar the door after that. It doesn't ever look back. You know, this is one of those roses that we have a category of you want to have a small climber, you want to graduate it from that. This one fits in that category of it will swallow small children. You know, so if you need to make your neighbors disappear, that one fits in that category, but it does it nicely because it's thornless. And it blooms in the spring heavily, but it also will have, as it ages, a small fall bloom as well. But it's a worthwhile rose, and it's one of those that was a natural cross. It had never been introduced, so it's in the trade. We've shipped that rose to Oregon. We've shipped it to New York. We've shipped it to Miami. I get the best feedback from that climber. It will grow anywhere. No two ways about it. Now, perennials, of course, all of you know a perennial by definition, it's any plant that comes back from the original crown 3 years or more. And I just want to share with you a few of those that we've been really, really pleased with. And this is a Georgia native, whirling butterflies or Gora lindheimeri. This is one of those 2.5, 3 foot perennials that comes up with long spikes of blooms that look like small butterflies. They call it whirling butterflies because wind movement and it moves with it. It blooms spring, and then we cut the stalks back. It blooms summer, we cut the stalks back, and it blooms fall. It wants at least half a day to a full day of sun and good drainage. It's exceptionally drought tolerant. It doesn't want to be in the wet spot in your garden, and definitely not in front of the sprinkler head. A little bit later on in the season, the lily that blooms in August, and you've seen this, they've naturalized in Georgia as well as in Alabama. We call it the Formosa or Philippine lily, and that thing will come up to a height of 6+ feet, and it stands up on its own 2 feet, but it blooms in August. I think anybody that blooms in August should get a blue ribbon for sure. And good height, a nice lily type of bulb, multiplies quite readily, and deer don't eat it. You know, so I always like to think about that. Another category of perennial that I love to think of for fall bloom especially are the salvias. And salvias can bloom like La Trinidad and the Gregias we're going to look at. They bloom spring, they bloom summer, they bloom fall, but they've got other characteristics that are nice. Many of you are concerned and interested in attracting bees. Some of you are beekeepers. This is a plant that thankfully has a long sequence of bloom. La Trinidad blooms at about 2 feet in height. Salvia farinacea, the mealy cup sage like Henry Dewberg, blooms at 3 to 4 feet in height. The Gregias, like raspberry, and here raspberry and pink, they bloom at 2 to 3 feet in height. They're evergreen during the winter. So when you see these guys blooming, we're going to get spring, we're going to get summer. Every time they finish a sequence of bloom, cut them. Just like that Gora, and they regrow and they continue flowering. But you'll get bees, you'll get butterflies, you get hummingbirds, but deer don't eat them. And so to me, when you talk about tough perennials, in our display gardens, one of the things that we look for, we do not use an irrigation system in our display gardens outside of the fruit gardens. So when we're getting these plants established, we're going to give them the right exposure, we're going to do good soil preparation, but there's no irrigation system. We're going to water them once per week deeply through the first summer that they're in the garden. After that, they're on their own. And salvias are exceptionally drought tolerant. This is one of my favorite old-fashioned ones. This one goes back to the 1820s. It's another plant that's native to China that when explorers brought that plant over and naturalized beautifully in our gardens, it has an iris type of foliage. So you can see it's in that iris family. But Bellum canda chinensis, or blackberry lily, flowers during July and August and September. Tough times to have color in the garden. Its foliage is evergreen during the winter, and this is what the flower looks like as it's opening. But then when it finishes flowering, it twists. Then there's a pod, the seed pod right behind it, that swells, and then in the fall, it opens, revealing the seed that look exactly in the shape and color of blackberries. So it was a medicinal herb that we grow just because it's pretty. And it can take full blazing sun, flowers at about 2 to 2.5 feet in height, and then it will drop those seed. And so it not only is a perennial from the root, multiplying, but it also comes back from seed. And then another one, Texas is quick to take credit for a lot of great plants. This plant is also native to Georgia and Alabama, and it will grow in swamps. I'm thinking there are a number of great natives in the gardens just right over here behind us, and I'm thinking this is one of those guys that's in that garden, if I'm not mistaken. And I love Texas star hibiscus that can tolerate wet soils, can tolerate full blazing sun, but also can bloom with dappled light. But this guy flowers at 6+ feet in height. So this is an exceptional perennial that multiplies from the base, can tolerate some of the worst conditions in the garden, and can flower from late spring, summer, all the way through to fall. And from 6+ feet in height, freezes to the ground in the winter, only to come back in the spring with friends. And that part I like. What about the fall blooming chrysanthemums? We're all used to seeing the used to seeing the mums in the fall that are kind of this pom-pom type version. Well, the old-fashioned chrysanthemums, what my grandmother would have called October daisies, are brilliant in our gardens for not only evergreen foliage, low-growing evergreen foliage, but if you have half a day of sun or more, they'll start flowering often late August, 1st of September, and flower all the way through until frost. This is one that we collected called Kathy's Rust, which flowers at about 2.5 to 3 feet in height. Wonderful fall bloomer, great pollinator magnet this time of the year. That's Ryan's Pink, same kind of height, 2.5 feet. The crimson, this is a chrysanthemum, called Hillside Sheffield. We grow it as cream, and it's not quite as tall. It's a little bit more compact version, only about 12 to 15 inches in height. Great fall bloomer. And then Turk's Cap. This is a southwestern native that I love to grow. Has anybody got Turk's Cap in your garden? Yes. How tall is your Turk's Cap? It's above your head height. Yes, that's it. Same here. Turk's Cap, when we first collected it, was in a shade garden. And it now grows in our herb garden just because I needed a place to put it. And it's full blazing sun out there. And it begins flowering in the spring, late spring, summer, and it flowers all the way through until frost. And it's in a well-drained spot with no irrigation system, and it doesn't seem to be bothered. It is very attractive to our hummingbirds, and then the sulfur butterfly especially comes through and just covers it up as they're coming through our area. But we don't run into a common pest problem. And the area that it's native to in the southwest gets 8 to 10 inches of annual rainfall. You know, in Noonan right here, you get on average about 55 inches of annual rainfall. Wouldn't it be nice if that happened 1 inch per week? It would be, I mean, come on, that would be perfect. We wouldn't ask for anything else, for sure. But it doesn't happen that way. You know, we're on a good stretch right now where we really all could use a good rain. We're getting toward good temperatures, but we need that rainfall that we normally count on for the fall, for sure. Turk's Cap can handle it. One more salvia I want to throw out there, and that's the Mexican bush sage, Salvia leucantha. This one only flowers in the late summer, fall. And we love this one, again, for all those attributes: bees, butterflies, hummingbirds. Its ability to tolerate long periods of dry conditions. It freezes to the ground in the winter, and then it races back up to 4 to 5 feet in height, that much in width, the following spring. Butterfly ginger, that's another good August bloomer. Remember that Philippine lily we were looking at? The butterfly ginger is another good 4 to 5 foot ginger, multiplies quite readily and handles the heat and flowers with a fragrant bloom during the late summer, early fall. I want to mention a few herbs, perennial herbs primarily also, that we've observed are equally tough. And herbs, thankfully, fall in that category. If you've grown them, you know that these fall into a category of low maintenance. Herbs, I think, can thrive more often on neglect. You can pamper an herb to death much easier, for certain. The upright forms of rosemary, as well as the prostrate forms of rosemary, these are a must-have for your culinary uses, as well as just a beautiful evergreen shrub. This is Tuscan blue. It's one of the more cold-hardy selections. I brought one with me today called ARP. That was one that Madeline Hill found from the hill country in Texas, outside of ARP, Texas. That is an excellent selection. Good cold hardiness, beautiful blue blooms that the bees love. Agastache, this is Anise hyssop, and we're always looking for more of this. Anise hyssop, especially for a pollinator attractant, is really, really nice. And this is a thin leaf form with licorice type of aroma. This has been a good performer for us. Good blooms, so we have that component, but fragrant foliage that deer don't like. And of course, you all know about echinacea, the purple cone flowers. There's tons of varieties out there. I'm still finding that most of the old-fashioned or native selections are as tough, if not tougher, than many of the new varieties that I've been sampling and trying. And in bloom right now, this is a super herb called Texas tarragon, and it's a true perennial marigold. And this grew for my brother-in-law when he was in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and where they got 5 inches to 8 inches of annual rainfall, and it grows very well for us. It's super drought tolerant. It only flowers in the fall, so it makes a beautiful show, but every part of that plant is edible, the leaves and the flowers. It's good butterfly attractant. We got butterflies up here and got bees right there. So I like that one. Excellent drought tolerance, for sure. And then lavenders. I have to confess, anytime I talk about lavender, I have killed a lot of lavender. I feel guilty sometimes about the amount of lavender I've killed, but I'm always looking for and trying to find some lavender that we can grow here. When you look at the lavender fields that are grown out west, there are a lot of characteristics that are unique out there that allow them to have success with them. And I will never forget, before Madeline Hill passed away, and she and her daughter, Gwen Barclay, wrote a wonderful book called Southern Herb Growing. And it's not in print anymore, so if you find a book on a shelf somewhere or on the internet, please get it. It's the most concise, well-written book from a Southern gardener's perspective on herbs. It's called Southern Herb Gardening. And she and her daughter, Gwen Barclay, not only grew wonderful herbs, but they had a restaurant in the hill country of Texas also, where they served and showed you how to take that from the garden to the table. And when I had an opportunity to speak at an Oktoberfest in Texas, they were having a dinner afterwards. And so I was so excited. I got to make my presentation, and they showed me beforehand where dinner was going to be served. And so as soon as I finished my program, I dropped the microphone, I dropped the remote, and I ran and I sprinted ahead of Madeline to find out where she was going to sit so I could sit right beside her. And I got that seat. And I said, Madeline, I'm going to start with a confession. I'm killing a lot of lavender. And she said, there's 3 things. She said, first of all, Jason, I know you're growing the wrong lavender. She said, you're trying to grow the English lavender. And English lavender is not going to grow in Alabama. It hates it. It'll grow 1 year, and then you're done with it. So varieties like Hidcote, those are exceptionally difficult to grow. It's Lavandula angustifolia. So when you look at that botanical name, Lavandula angustifolia will be an annual for you and I. And she said the second thing is, she said, your soil is clay. You don't drain well enough. And she said another thing about your soil, your pH is too low. Your acid pH is great for your azaleas, your blueberries, and your camellias. It's horrible for lavender. So she said, the first thing you got to do is start growing the right lavenders. And for you and I, we can grow Lavandula stoicus, Spanish lavenders. Sometimes it's called French lavender, but it's always Lavandula stoicus. And it flowers with these shorter little buds with 2 little bunny ears right on the top. It's the first lavender to bloom in the spring. It's evergreen during the winter, but it only gets, 2 to 3 feet max in height. And the minute it finishes blooming, you cut it. And so I talked to her about that at length for that evening, and she straightened me out. Not only can we grow Spanish lavender, we can grow the lavender crosses, the intermedia hybrids. And those are going to be Lavandula. And when you look at the tag, it should say Lavandula X intermedia. And varieties will include Grosso, Provence, and Phenomenal more recently. We can grow those lavenders. They're far more forgiving of our heavy clay soils and fluctuations in moisture, but we still have to add lime to the soil to raise the pH. Make sure that you've got great drainage, make sure that you get your pH, and it's not a one-time deal. You can mix lime in at planting for lavender, but you every 2 years at least need to add more lime around the base of that plant to keep that pH elevated. And then finally she told me, she said, as soon as that lavender finishes blooming, you cut it. And I said, if I get it to grow, I'm not pruning it. And she said, you're going to kill it. And she said, you don't prune it. And then, like rosemary often does, it continues to get woody at the base and only flowers at the top. And eventually, it's not going to get any new growth to rejuvenate. So she said, you prune it after it finishes flowering and report back to me. So I did. And we've been able to grow lavender, thankfully, ever since. Get the drainage right. Get the pH right, get the right variety of lavender, and you and I can be successful with it for sure. So I wouldn't trade that dinner for anything. And then another salvia. In the herb section, pineapple sage. This one only blooms in the fall. 3-4 feet in height, beautiful red blooms. Again, we're going to get butterflies, hummingbirds, the whole 9 yards with this salvia. Freezes to the ground, comes right back from the base in the spring. This is a green leaf form, but there's also a gold leaf form of pineapple sage that you and I can grow. Super tough herb as well. Just a few shrubs I want to mention. This is native to Georgia, Vaccinium darrowi. This particular low-growing blueberry is evergreen during the winter. Only gets 3 feet tall by about that wide. It's a southeastern native. My favorite selection of this was introduced a few years back, and it's called Rosa's Blush. Rosa's Blush. And 3 feet tall by about that wide, beautiful white blooms that bees love in the spring, and then it produces a blueberry that's a little bigger than a BB. You know, so take 1 million of them to fill a pint, but your birds will love you for this. The birds can get underneath there. They're hidden. They can nest. They can eat. It makes a great, great little low-growing ground cover. It can take full sun, but its native habitat is actually filtered sunlight, like pine shade. Spirea japonica. I love all of the white-flowered spireas as well, but Spirea japonica, like Anthony Waterer, gets about 3 feet tall and about that wide. This one's actually Spirea bumalda, and it's like the Japanese spireas in that we get a beautiful umbel-shaped bloom, like Queen Anne's lace. And it blooms spring, and it blooms summer, and it blooms fall. Anthony Waterer, easily we can maintain it 3 feet in height, that much in width, but it's exceptionally drought tolerant. Deer don't eat it. Butterflies like the blooms. And it doesn't have a common pest problem. There's not an insect or disease. I can grow it in a full day sun, or I can grow it with 2 to 3 hours of sunlight. And it doesn't matter. It could be morning sun or it could be afternoon sun. Alan was talking about the mophead hydrangeas. I also am a big fan of the lace cap hydrangeas, those that have the larger blooms around the outside and the fertile blooms on the inside. So we have the big show out here, but when we have these guys open in here, it's a bee festival for sure. They love to get in there and go to them. The best exposure for us with varieties like Blue Wave is morning sun. If you're going to have any direct sun, morning only, and afternoon shade for certain. Or they can grow in filtered light throughout the whole day. But these guys are no slouches. They're going to be, depending on your variety, shoulder height and shoulder width. And this is not a good shot of the whole shrub, but I love the fragrant tea olives or sweet olives. Is anybody growing this shrub? Yes. You know that shrub goes back to the mid-1700s, and I call it a shrub. The ones we have at the nursery are trees. The original Osmanthus fragrans, the most appropriate botanical name. It's evergreen. It grows more upright, not quite as wide. It can tolerate whatever you throw at it, but it was brought over in the mid-1700s. Do you know that it was replaced in the 1930s by a shrub that grew faster, that was also evergreen with a similar shape? That shrub had red new growth and larger green leaves. Does anybody know what that name was? Yes, red tip Photinia. Red tip photinia displaced the tea olive in the landscape in the 1930s because it was faster growing. It didn't have fragrant blooms, but it was faster growing and it can make a nice hedge. And then unfortunately, we all planted it through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, only to find out some years later that it was susceptible to intimasporium leaf spot, fungal disease. And then you had to start spraying this thing to grow it. And nobody wants to do that. Anytime that we're in a good meeting with great gardeners like we are today, and I say, what's your top 5 favorite things to do as garden tasks in the garden? No one has ever stood up and said, strapping on a 5-gallon backpack sprayer and blasting everything in the garden. Nobody's ever said that. So we see, thankfully, tea olives even though they got displaced, they survived. They survived at old home places where they originally been planted. And when red tips started getting intimasporium leaf spot, the nurserymen raced back to the old home places, did cuttings of tea olives, brought them back into production. And now, not only do we have brilliant tea olives back in the landscape in all sizes, but we've got the orange flowered tea olives that I first saw as a little boy across the lake at Callaway Gardens. And it was just magnificent. Blooms only in the fall. And I'm pretty sure it was a mile across the pond and I could see it and smell it. But, you know, these guys have been around, they've survived. I brought with me this morning a variety called a Fadzingu, which is a dwarf tea olive. You're pretty tough when you're a dwarf and you're still 10 feet. You know, I mean, that's impressive. And then last but not least, I want to talk about just a handful of fruit plants that you and I can grow in our garden that fall under the tough category. We're not going to talk about peach, plum, or nectarine, no stone fruits, because those are higher maintenance. Blackberries are an easy small fruit that you and I can grow. The variety I would love for you to consider is thorned, but we have 1.5 acres of trellis blackberries that are for a U-pick operation. And this is out of the University of Arkansas's breeding program. They average in their second year 12 to 15 pounds per plant. How many blackberry plants do you have to have? Only one. They're self-fruitful. So you don't have to have another variety for cross-pollination, but blackberries grow with this particular variety grows with a semi-erect cane. So it kind of leans over. You have to stake it and tie it to grow it. It's very straightforward, very easy, and this is one of the varieties that Dad's helped us to develop a technique for that allows us to harvest large quantities. And 1.5 acres of trellis blackberries, you know, that is a lot of blackberries. It's not enough to supply the demand. Blueberries, another one. Nobody has to talk to anybody in Georgia about growing blueberries because you know how great this variety, this plant type is. The rabbit eye class especially make beautiful 6-8 foot shrubs in your landscape. They flower beautifully white in the spring. They have delicious fruit in the summer. The fall color is spectacular. The leaves are off in the winter and they have an exfoliating bark. This is an attractive, functional, edible plant that we can grow. You do require 2 different varieties for cross-pollination, and on all these fruit plants, the more sun, the better. Figs. We are absolutely fig fanatics. We have all of these. I mentioned my dad having 7 acres of display fruit gardens. He uses these for teaching orchards, but we also use it for diversification. All of these are open for you pick. And I have lots of people that come to our nursery for blackberries. They'll pick blackberries all day long. They'll pick blueberries. But do you know everybody that comes to the nursery wants me to pick the figs and have them ready. They don't want to go out and pick their own figs. And I understand, but the flavor, and there's so much diversity. This is a ripe fig. Lemon fig. It doesn't have lemon flavor. It's more large size and lemon color. LSU purple. We don't like to give LSU credit for anything. But this is their fig, and it is a really good fig. That lemon fig, like the ones our grandmothers grew, Celeste and Brown Turkey, they fruit for about 4 weeks. LSU purple fruits for 7 weeks. So it's a long sequence. That fig with the darker skin color has a pink flesh that's sweet for fresh eating. But that dark skin can go on the grill or the broiler and be used. We deliver to about 11 restaurants in the Birmingham area, and this is their favorite for us to work with. Pomegranates. Wonderful, wonderful fruit. Self-fruitful, just like the fig. So we've talked about blackberry, you only have to have one. Fig, you only have to have one. Pomegranates, you also can have just one. They are self-fruitful, multi-trunked, small tree. We've tried so many different varieties over the last 28 years. We still keep coming back to a variety called Wonderful. And it is a good variety. There's not a commercial pomegranate production in Georgia or Alabama or Mississippi because they're not that consistent. But in a backyard, it's a beautiful plant for you and I to grow. Japanese persimmon, this is the season that we're in right now. And this is the fruit that we encourage any home gardener that wants to start with just one tree. Please consider growing the Japanese persimmon. You and I can grow a 12 to 15 foot tree. They're self-fruitful. They produce a sweet fruit that is squatty and orange and seedless. So this is not the persimmon that your sister tricked you into trying when you were growing up, right? So this is the sweetest fruit I've ever had, Jason. Try that. Well, I bit into that, and I'll never forget that. Pulled the moisture right out of your mouth, right? But this is the sweet one. It's grafted onto the native persimmon that she got me to try. So we get the drought tolerance of the native persimmon, but we get the fruit of the large, sweet persimmon. And you pick it while they're firm. You don't have to wait for a frost. You can eat it like an apple. Crisp texture, or you can let it go completely soft on the inside and it's delicious. And the sugar becomes even more concentrated. But there's not a common insect or disease problem with this tree. So it makes a beautiful tree and an orange-red fall color with the foliage. It's a wonderful addition to the landscape. And then last but not least, citrus. There's so much interest in growing citrus, and if you'll remember that with citrus, they are self-fruitful. You can have one plant. It doesn't matter whether it's a satsuma, like the oranges that I brought with me today, or a lime. The key is remembering the critical temperature on, if you'll just keep in mind that on all of your citrus, you and I in Noonan would be growing in a container preferably, because the the critical temperature is 28 degrees Fahrenheit. If it gets below that, we're going to lose that foliage, and then it's either, if we don't lose the plant, we're at least not going to make a crop that same season typically, because it's the only evergreen fruit crop that we've discussed. All the other ones are temperate, deciduous fruits. They lose their leaves during there in the winter. And so those are just a few of the tough plants that I thought would be good for you to consider for your southern gardens. I'm up against the 3-hour mark, Alan, for sure, I know. And I want to thank you so much, though, for the invitation to come and to talk with you. And then I'll stick around. If we don't have time now, I can stick around for questions. Are we okay time-wise for questions? Or
We're okay. Let's take a couple of questions.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
How long does it take to drive to your nursery?
From here, we are about 2.5 hours to get here. So to me, the easiest route to go, I like to go interstate, because you can go from here down through Auburn, go through Montgomery, and then pick up 65, because we're only 1.1 miles off the interstate, for sure. And thank you for that question.
What's the name of it again?
Jemison, we call Petals from the Past in Jemison, Alabama.
If you go on the internet and check their schedule, they have classes on the weekends, various types of horticultural classes. So it's a great opportunity and a learning experience. Yes, right there.
Yes, sir.
Pruning large, old fig bushes.
Yes. The question is pruning large, old fig bushes. We had maybe 7 years ago a late freeze on our fig trees, which were at that point in about their 10th or 11th year. So when we're growing a fig, we like to grow it with an open center, right? Not a fig tree like I grew up climbing in Tifton, Georgia, but we had scaffold limbs that were coming out like, if we were looking at it from an aerial view, like a blooming onion, almost, with 2 feet of space between them. The scaffold limbs were that big. We had a hard freeze. The figs had already leafed out. And you think it's spring when the figs leaf out, because they're one of the last things to leaf out. These had leafed out and we still had a hard freeze. It froze those figs back to the original trunk. So we chainsaw pruned them in March, best month to prune a fig, and we regrew them. So we didn't lose the root system. We didn't lose the trunk, but we had to regrow those stems, some from the trunk and some, of course, coming from the ground, from root sprouts that came up. So the timing is key, because figs fruit on new growth. March is the month to prune them, right here in central Georgia. And then don't be shy. We like to have scaffold limbs that are coming out wide rather than going straight up. So we try to go for the most width. We try to open the center. And if I have 9 scaffold limbs, I think that's perfect, because then that means I can go the whole way around. I can create a window by having 2 feet between in the scaffold limbs so I can reach inside to get the figs as well as outside. We're trying our best to keep everybody off of a ladder, so lower pruning. Does that cover you? Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, one more question there in the back.
The roses you spoke about first, are they all in line? You didn't talk about deer resistance.
She said, the question was, she said, the old roses you talked about, you didn't talk about their deer resistance because, unfortunately, I have thorny old garden roses. The deer will munch right through them. So if you have deer, they do not mix very well, unfortunately, with roses, for sure. But
Okay, all right, thank you so much.
thank you very much.
Donna Dees. Elizabeth Camp. Elizabeth Camp. Art Thompson. You know, if you do not see a friend here today, there's a possibility they're going to be here tonight. All right. I would like to encourage you, if you didn't see a friend, text them and say, hey, we had a great time at BYA this morning. Because I fear that the information, you know, it's going to miss some people. Barbara France. Ed Atkinson. These are a lot of regulars here. Pauline Carnes. No. Yeah, Pauline Carnes. Michael Williams. Is there a Michael Williams in here other than Michael Williams? Okay, go ahead and get your prize. Nobody else. But the name, I think maybe when they recorded the name, they put Sheila Vera. Sheila Vera. Audrey Harrelson. We have the winner. Diane Keir. Okay, the rose is gone. Ruth Phillips. Lucy O'Farrell. Lucy O'Farrell. Okay, a little drum roll here. Rochelle Javelin. Okay. This being our final program of the year, look forward to seeing you in January. Hope you have a great holiday. I'd like to send you off with a thought. That the good Lord bless and keep you whether near or far away. May your life be filled with blessings to be shared with friends each day. May your troubles all be small and your fortunes 10 times 10. And may the good Lord bless and keep you till we meet again. See you next year.